So I went from the girls unit to the co-ed unit to Ward D. It's the ward where they put everybody they just don't know what to do with anymore. They just don't know what to do with. And by then I was a vision for you. I'd sit on the day room couch, and I'd no longer been bathing or getting dressed, because you don't have to do that to date in the nut house. And I had casts on both my arms up to my shoulders because I've been cutting, because that's just a whole different way to change your reality when you got no booze and you got no sufficient substitute. And I'd sit there and smoke my cigarettes and be the queen of the day room. I met the love of my life there on the day room, in that day room. He came in for 17 days to kick heroin, to get better like we do. And I realized too there had to be something wrong with him. I always think it's just me, but that dude walked into the front door early one morning. I was sitting on the couch, and he walked in and he looked across the room and he said, "I got to have her. That's the one. She's it right there." And I went over the wall with him, and we lasted about 2.5 weeks. I told you I spent a year in there. That was my home. I'd found my way out of that nut house, under the gate, sometimes over the fence. I don't know whose bright idea it was to walk us through to parent group through an unlocked lobby door, but they did. And I put my street clothes on under my pajamas, and if everybody's looking just the right other ways, you make a break for it. And sometimes you make it and sometimes you don't, but it's always worth a shot, you know what I mean? And I'd go out for a week or two and come back in the front door, because that was where I lived. That was my home. And so it's all that time later, and I meet him, and we're over the wall, and we lasted about 2.5 weeks. I was 16, he was 22. I was coming off Thorazine. He introduced me to cocaine, and I think it was just too much of a contrast for him. He just really didn't know what he was getting into, nor did I. And oddly enough, my probation officer knew exactly where to find me. Took me a little while to realize that he'd called her. "Come get her, she's right here, please." That hurt my feelings. And then back into juvenile hall and sitting in front of a judge, waiting for placement. You might as well have stamped it on my forehead. That was just somewhere along the line, we've always got that dichotomy going on. I can be better than you and worse than you, all in the same sentence, or all in the same thought. There were times that I felt that I had been locked up as I felt sort of like a political prisoner, you know what I mean? And then there were other times that I started to surrender along the way, that maybe I was just one of those little nut house lifers that just sometimes you get out for a little while and you're always going to end up back inside. And the insanity about that was every time I got out there, I was doing the very things that got me locked up, right back at it. So I spent most of my adolescence in one lockup or another, in a rehab and stuff like that, and ended up in a girls' home at the end of all of that. I was 17 years old, and it was kind of like a halfway house for young girls, young women. They taught us how to go grocery shopping and things like that, and I met my roommate there. And I've always been a seeker. I experienced that presence of God, that feeling, long before I ever took a drink. But I just couldn't tap into it long enough for it to make any sense in my life, or for it to be anything really real for me in my life. And I'd been exposed to a lot. And I'm proactive, as you can probably tell. I don't sit around much. I get busy. And I was born into a Southern Baptist home, and that worked real well for my mom, and I just couldn't hear it. It wasn't that there wasn't anything valid about it, I just couldn't hear it. And I tried being a Catholic for a couple of weeks in 4th grade, and if something doesn't work right away, I'm about as deep as a mud puddle sometimes. I gotta go. And I burned black candles for a couple of years, praying to the other guy, just trying to hedge my bets, really, that's all. I just want to be on the side that's winning. I don't care, And then somewhere along the line, I had gotten this idea. The television series Kung Fu came out when I was in about the 6th grade. Some of you might remember it from way back then, and some of you might now see it on cable TV in the middle of the night. But David Carradine was a star of the show. He played a Shaolin priest, and that dude walked the Wild West in bare feet. He was tough. And he was so serene, and I'd watch him, and he'd he'd walk through town and people would come and try to kill him, and they'd be mad at him for almost no reason. You couldn't tell really, but they'd be after him and wanting to kill him. And he'd look at them and pearls of wisdom would just roll off his tongue. He'd change their lives in 3 words. He'd say something and they'd change. And it was just so peaceful but strong. And the best part about him was when they messed with him, he kicked their ass. And this was a sense of strength and serenity that I could relate to, so I picked it up. That along with the spirit of the 60s, they had peace and love and flowers and Gandhi. And, there was just that subtle strength that I was so attracted to and still couldn't reach. So I was carrying this along with me. I got to this girl's home, and my roommate, she's on the same page. Man. And all our friends said, man, you got to go to Oregon. All those people moved to Oregon. You got to go to Oregon where God might be. We went out the 2nd-story window and down the tree outside of that girl's home and into Randy's truck and off to Oregon where God might be. And they let me come with them, and I thought life might change, or I might change from the outside in. They rented a little house. They let me come with them, and we planted a garden in their front yard. And that's where I learned that when they talk about hoeing in Springfield, Oregon, they meant with a garden tool. And they did it in their front yard. But 2 things happened that I could only see looking back. I certainly couldn't see it when it was happening. And one was we couldn't always drink the way I needed to drink. I was a terrible thief, and I wasn't going to go back to lock up for that. But so we couldn't always drink the way I needed to drink. And when I've got no booze and I've got nothing to block me from me and you, nothing to buffer you from me, and no steps or fellowship or God of my understanding, I am restless, irritable, and discontent, very hard to get along with. And when I can drink the way I needed to drink, I was always overshooting the mark. And that was happening again and still at 17 years old, and I couldn't stop. And my friends had to ask me to leave, and I was asked to leave a lot. I ended up in a roundabout way back in my father's house after a few years, and he, against his better judgment, let me come stay with him. And so I'm, 17 years old, and we'd both get up at the same time in the morning, and he'd take off for work, and I'd go into his den and I'd start to drink, and I'd drink from his liquor cabinet all day long. And he'd come home at the end of the day, and he'd see me sitting in the very spot where he'd left me that morning, and he'd have that broken-hearted look in his eyes, and I had nothing to say for myself. I didn't know I was afraid, so I didn't know how to tell him I was afraid. I didn't know how to go out there in the world and make a living and spend 8 hours with you today and all day, and then come home and go back and do that again. I didn't know how to tell him. I didn't know where the last few years of my life had gone. So right before my 18th birthday, my father had to come to me and say what I know were the hardest words he ever had to say to me, and that was, I'm not going to watch you die, and I'm not going to let you do it. You got to go. And on my way out the door, all I could remember was that one of the counselors at the rehab had told me I was a great actress. And I know today I must have misunderstood, because I ended up out on Hollywood Boulevard, and there's not a lot of auditioning going on out there, I got to tell you. I was 18 years old, starting my days off with a pint of Pop-Out vodka, and I would go wherever the day took me. And some days it was a party, and some days it was just surviving. And there was not a lot of hope about it getting any different. And to this day, I love driving through Hollywood, and I love looking at that same bus stop on Sunset Boulevard near Poinsettia Avenue, and I see a whole new generation of the same girls sitting out there with very little hope about it getting any different. And I get to say a prayer of gratitude for myself and a prayer of hope for her, that maybe she'll get to find what I found here in Alcoholics Anonymous if alcoholism is her problem. Sometimes I get to talk to one like that. Some girls, when I give this talk afterward, they'll come up to me and say, I was there. I know what you're talking about. And I love that. The promises have come true to be able to share and to see how our experience can benefit others. And a few months into that, I met a man walking down Hollywood Boulevard, and I saw the light in his eyes, and I didn't realize it was orange sunshine, but we hit it off. And I moved in with him that night, and I didn't even know his last name. And 6 weeks later, he's asking me to leave, and I still don't know his last name. But I like to bring him up because years later he was on my 8-step list. He was someone who came to mind very quickly and clearly that I owed him amends. He'd been nothing but kind to me, and in 6 weeks I'd been that proverbial tornado, just gone through his life, physically, materially, spiritually, mentally, in every way I could. No good deed went unpunished with him, But I couldn't find him. I spent the last part of my first year of sobriety looking for him, and my sponsor finally said, you know, you're just going to have to set that down for a while. If you're supposed to find that guy, you'll find him, but leave it alone. It's unproductive. You've done your best, and now leave him alone, and you'll find him in God's time if you're supposed to find him. In the meantime, there are some things you can do to change yourself, like try being a friend to a man in a vertical fashion. Why don't you start there? And she was right, you know. You follow a few simple physical rules, you know, how do you do? And God, I love that feeling though today. My sobriety date, by the way, is September 25th, 1987. So I haven't had a drink in in almost 24 years, a little over 23. And that's a you're clapping for. I love that feeling of self-respect. You know, right underneath that feeling of being useful is that feeling of self-respect. Where I walk into the room now, and unless it's an AA meeting or something else, you know, all the men in the room don't know exactly why I'm there. You know, and all the women aren't looking at me with either disdain or pity. I can walk into a room and I can look you in the eye, and that's valuable to me. And these days I have those internal signals to tell me when I'm getting too close, you know, when I'm starting to ride the edge of giving that stuff away. And I traded them away willingly before. I'm not willing to trade them away today, and I love it. I love who you've made me. I love who you've given me instructions to become, or how to become. Anyway, it was right before my 13th AA birthday. I had to go give a talk on the other side of town, and it was a hot Sunday afternoon, and I didn't feel like going, and thank God you guys have taught me it's not how I feel, it's what I do that matters. And I went up and I gave that talk, and I used to think I could blow off a dinner for two and not be missed. You know, I just didn't think that it mattered at all if I showed up. So I went out and I gave that talk, and of course I felt better. And when the thank you line came through at the end of that meeting, this man stopped and he said, "Where were you in 1976?" And it was a guy from Hollywood Boulevard standing in front of me with 8.5 years of sobriety, and I with almost 13. Now only a very well-organized, loving God could have made that happen when I, in all my efforts to get that done, couldn't get it done. I couldn't get it done. And I just like to tell that story because it reminds me always that God's timing is always perfect. Always perfect, even when I don't think it's happening fast enough. And it happens these days, you know, when there's so much uncertainty, so we can't get a job or can't get a consistent job. I mean, we're all in those times when we don't know what's going to happen. And I think back on that story, you know, I have some experience now to count on, even when I don't know how it's going to turn out, or it always comes from left field. So I got to make those direct amends to him, and he said, "Oh my God, Carla, that's long forgiven, long forgotten. I just can't believe you're still alive." And he's right. You know, if we're in this room today, we're the lucky ones. We're the lucky ones. Somehow, some way, we've managed to slip through that window of grace one more day to come in here and sit together and recharge and regroup and see what we can pack into the stream of life out there and come back in. And that was a long time to come, though, and I spent the rest of that year in Hollywood and hooked up with another guy from another rehab, you know, because that's where all the boyfriends are. And again, flying on the coattails of the 60s and that sense of strength and serenity I had going on in my head, you know, I love that peace and love, and so did he. We were just, you know, really, we had that, you know, we had those philosophical ideals like peace and love and flowers and all that stuff. We just couldn't stop knocking the hell out of each other really long enough to implement the principles fully of peace and love. And so we beat each other up and down the California coast, and we pitched a tent in the mountains in southern Oregon and lived there till the rains came. And then we moved into a roofless cabin, our old bird out cabin, and we threw a plastic tarp over the top, called it a skylight until the baby came. And then we had this little girl, and I thought having this little girl was going to change the way I drank. And, you know, we all know that alcoholism doesn't care who you love. Just doesn't matter. I thought it was going to be a little girl, booze, and everything else. And it turned out to be booze, little girl, and everything else. And when she was about 10 months old, she got in the way of one of his and I fights, and I had to take her up to Idaho, where it's got to be better somewhere else. You know, it just always felt to me like hope was just up the road.